So my name's Megan. I'm obviously here for SOS SEN. I've been a volunteer. I currently work for the charity, and I'm also a teacher by profession. And I have three kids with additional needs myself. And so a lot of the content here comes from lived experience plus studying and having worked in education as well. So we're going to have a think tonight about the question, does my child have special educational needs? And obviously, if you're watching this, then you've probably had some questions in your mind as to whether that's the case. And so what we're going to do tonight is to have a think about what some of the signs might be if your child is struggling in school, and there might be some additional needs alongside that. We'll have a look at some definitions and then think about what that might look like in practice, and then a little bit about what you might want to do with that. So I am in my house. I do have my three kids wandering around. I'm afraid my husband is out. So you may find that I end up having a quick conversation over my shoulder. So apologies if that is the case. Okay, so let's think first of all about the sorts of signs that your child might be struggling. And this can look very different in different children. And you might first notice that your child's struggling with their academic work. So perhaps you've noticed that they're concerned about their schoolwork. They seem to be falling behind. Maybe you're getting comments from teachers in books. You're looking at the marking that's being done. Or you're noticing grades are falling. And you might notice that they're falling behind with their work or falling away, struggling to keep up with their peers. So perhaps they're still in primary school. You might notice that their reading isn't developing like you might expect it to. And this can sometimes be evident if you've got more than one child and you kind of think, well, my other child was doing X by this age, and this child doesn't seem to be doing that. So that might give you the first inkling that academically they are struggling a little bit. You might also notice it with homework. I mean, obviously nowadays you get homework right from the start in reception all the way through, and it might be that they are struggling to understand the homework that's set, that they don't want to do it. I mean, I'm not sure any children want to do homework, but I think some children put up a much stronger fight than others. You might notice that they require a lot of support from you to do their homework. You need to be sat with them to regulate them, to explain the instructions, to help them with the reading. And that might be giving you some indicators that your child's struggling to access the academic work. The thing is, special educational needs covers a much wider breadth than just academics. It also covers social issues as well. So you might have noticed that your child is having a lot of friendship issues. Maybe they're coming home from school and they're kind of crying because someone's not talking to them, or it seems that there's some bullying going on, or they just seem very unhappy in the playground, for example. That might be an indicator that there's a bit more going on. You may have noticed that their behaviour has changed. This might be the case at school. You might be getting the finger beckoning you over at the end of each day from the teacher to inform you of another misdemeanour that's been committed by your child that day. You again may notice comments written in homework diaries or in reports. But it may be that your child is perfect at school, and actually what you've noticed is that their behaviour at home has changed quite significantly. This can sometimes be in a withdrawn way. It might be that you're noticing angry outbursts as you leave school or once you've got home. It may be that their mood has changed and there's just something off and you can't quite put your finger on it, perhaps. It may be that either the teachers are telling you that they're struggling or your child is telling you that they're struggling. Sometimes when children tell us, it might be reported as, I don't like that subject, or it's boring, or I don't want to go. It might not necessarily come out as directly explaining what they think the problem is. But teachers, again, you might notice it in school reports. You might have a conversation with the teacher at the end of the school day. Might be something they comment about at parents' evening, for example. You may have noticed a change in your child's mood. They perhaps are more withdrawn, quieter, going out less, or they're a lot more angry, or they're a lot more quick to outbursts. There seem to be these huge explosions of behaviour that you're not quite sure why that's happened. Changes in habits is something we often notice. So perhaps they've started finding it harder to go to sleep. They've started waking up earlier or going to bed a lot later. Their diet may have changed, so they might have started eating more or restricting the amount of food that they eat. You might find that they've stopped getting dressed at weekends and that they're living in pajamas most of the time, or their self-care, their showering and their teeth brushing has decreased. And these are kind of giving you an idea that something's going on. They might worry a lot. Um, when they're younger, these worries can sometimes seem daft to us. They might start worrying about werewolves or, the sun exploding and causing a black hole and swallowing the earth. They might worry about the weather, for example. As they get older, it might be more worrying about their peer group or worrying about a particular teacher, but there might be a lot of sort of excessive worry. They might think less of themselves. They might say negative things about themselves. They might have a low opinion of whether they're worth knowing, for example. It may come across in health issues. So you might see tummy aches and headaches. Um, you might just there might be a general malaise. In some ways, they're just sort of trying to explain that things aren't right, but they can only say it in terms of physical ailments. And you may be at the state when they're starting to avoid school. Either they're struggling to get there in the morning, they're being very slow, or they're being deliberately sort of putting barriers in the way, or perhaps they're avoiding school completely and they're not going anymore. And actually thinking, well, this is a clear indicator that things are going on. So all these, either on their own or together, could give you some very clear indicators that your child is struggling. And you might be at the point of thinking, are there some special educational needs there? Can you all see the slide that says special educational needs? Someone put their thumbs up or just tell me.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. So just a quick definition here then. So special educational needs, when we talk about these, what we're talking about is a learning difficulty or a disability that needs support that is different from or additional to that's normally available to people of the same age in a mainstream school as a rule. So it becomes a special educational need when it needs support that isn't part of a standard, a standard education, if you like. So, for example, if they're going to need extra time to do a piece of work, then whatever the cause of that needing of extra time is, becomes a special educational need. They might need a one-to-one in order to help them sit still in lessons so they can concentrate. So then that inability to sit still becomes a special educational need. But it's worth thinking about these two terms here as well, learning difficulty or disability. So let's have a quick look at those. So a learning difficulty is when somebody has a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others at the same age, or has a disability which prevents or hinders them from making use of facilities generally provided for others of the same age in a mainstream school. And a disability is defined under the Equality Act as a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. And substantial here means more than minor or trivial, and long-term is 12 months or more. So, for example, anxiety or mental health can be a disability if it's long-term and if it's has a substantial impact on your life. And for many children, their anxiety prevents them from going to a mainstream school, and therefore they're not able to make the use of the facilities that are generally provided for from others the same age in a mainstream school. And therefore, that becomes a special educational need. Your child may have sensory issues. They may find travelling in a car really difficult because it makes them incredibly car sick, yet they would need to travel in a car to get to school. So therefore, that would prevent them from attending that school, and therefore that might be a special educational need. So when we're thinking about what special educational needs are, we need to be thinking about what is the impact of that on their ability to access an education, and is it hindering or preventing them from accessing the facilities normally available in a mainstream school? And if it is, then it may well be as an indicator that it is a special educational need. Now, within the kind of educational world, when we're talking about SEN, we tend to split it under 4 different headings. So that's what I'm going to look at today, just to kind of make it easier and give some natural lines. So we're going to look at them under the headings of communication and interaction, cognition and learning, social, emotional and mental health, and sensory and physical. And we're going to look at each of them in turn. And we're going to have a think about what sorts of things might come under those headings and what that might look like in a child. What sort of behaviour might you see that might indicate some of those needs? If you have any questions, then do kind of note them down or put them in the chat, or we can answer them as well if you need anything clarifying. So if we look at communication and interaction, first of all, it's important to note, I think, that there is a bit of crossover between communication and interaction and social, emotional, mental health, the social side and the interaction side. I wouldn't worry too much about which heading you're going to put information under. I tend to put kind of more intricate social issues under social, emotional, mental health and more direct communication stuff here, but it really doesn't matter as long as it goes somewhere. So first of all, when we're thinking about communication and interaction, we're thinking about language and the use of language. And we use language through expressive language. In other words, what we say, that's how we express ourselves. Now, for some children or some people, we might not use words to express ourselves. And therefore, that might mean that we find accessing mainstream facilities tricky. It may be that we can express ourselves with a verbal way of communication, but we have difficulty finding the words all of the time, and we sometimes struggle with that. You will see some very good examples of that by me over the course of this evening, and I'm sure many of you will empathise with that as well. And for some, that's quite significant. It really affects the flow of what they have to say. They might struggle with their breadth of vocabulary. In other words, the number of words that they use is relatively small and perhaps not equal to those of their peers. It may be that that they're still coming, still at the pre-verbal stages, so they are using vocalizations in order to get their needs understood, but they haven't quite got that into words yet. And alongside expressive language, we can think about how a person speaks. So, for example, whether they're able to make all of their speech sounds clearly. And if not, they may need some additional support to help them learn how to form those speech sounds, which would be more than is normally available in a mainstream school. It may be that they can speak, quite well, but it's not particularly clear. And sometimes that's to do with the coordination of their mouth, the coordination of lips and tongues, for example. And so they may need some support in order to help make their speech clearer so that they can get their needs understood. Some people are perfectly capable of speech and can be really quite, what's the word? Have a really good vocabulary, a really good ability to speak, but actually in certain situations or with certain people, they become what we can call situationally mute. So, they might be absolutely fine talking to mum, dad, brother, sister, but the minute they come to anybody from grandma to the shop assistant, they cannot speak. And so that can become a special educational need as well, because it can prevent them from getting their needs understood and met within different environments. So all of that might need support, but we then also have receptive language. So receptive language is what we understand of what other people say to us. So some people will have really good receptive language, but may not be able to express themselves verbally through expressive language. In normal speech development, in typical speech development rather, you'll find that receptive language develops before expressive language. So you'll notice with a toddler who may not yet be able to use words to speak, but you can say to them, go find your shoes, and they will have enough receptive language to understand what it is you want them to do. I certainly know with my boys that long before they could speak, if I mentioned the word ice cream, for example, they certainly understood what that word meant. A less typical way of development, and can be indicative developmentally of different processing, can be when your expressive language develops faster than your receptive language. And this can be tricky sometimes, because then if people are able to speak quite clearly and with a wide vocabulary, there is an assumption that they understand the same amount as what they're able to express. And that isn't always the case. And so that can lead to other people having higher expectations of perhaps how they behave, for example, or what they understand. And that can lead to difficulties, and again, can be a special educational need. But communication, as we know, is much wider than just what we're able to say, because we also communicate non-verbally. Sometimes we can use, you might hear the language of pragmatic language used, which is a similar word to kind of non-verbal language. And it's things that you already know. So it might be the use of a tone of voice, it might be facial expressions, it might be gestures, it might be understanding using personal space or volume of voices. And this can be an understanding of their own non-verbal expression. You may well find with your children that their volume is always incredibly high, but they just don't really seem to understand that. Or people might say that their facial expressions and their tone of voice don't match their moods. Sometimes they can be kind of have a very kind of calm looking face and a nice smile on their face. Now you may know them well enough to know that that tends to mean that they're kind of absolutely terrified and anxious, but someone else might just go, well, there's a happy child over there. I have the opposite, in that my face genuinely and often looks quite grumpy, and my tone of voice can be quite grumpy as well. And actually, often it's not the case. I'm absolutely fine. I have been known to I overheard some teenagers once muttering to themselves as I walked past them and saying to each other, "What's her problem? What's she looking at us like that for?" And I was really surprised, because actually I was pondering what I was going to eat for my dinner and was in a lovely state of mind. But that is not what my face told them was going on. But it might not just be how our body is communicating this, it also can be how we understand other people's non-verbal or pragmatic language. So you might find, for example, that your child thinks that people are shouting at them, when actually, from the other person's perspective, they're not shouting at them. My children used to really struggle because they couldn't hear or understand the incremental changes in tone of voice and the slight increases in volume as I got more and more frustrated that they were not doing the things that I was asking them to do. So, if we were trying to get ready to leave the house, you'd start with the pleasant request that they go and get their shoes on. And 15, 20 minutes later, after having sort of tried to make the point in kind of changing my language, changing my tone of voice, and increasing my volume, finally I've had enough. And I'm like, you go and get your shoes on. I kind of shout at them. And they were always incredibly shocked that I was shouting at them, and couldn't understand why I would be shouting about this. And it took me a while, but I began to realise that they weren't hearing the incremental changes. They just heard normal voice, normal voice, normal voice, shout. And so I had to start being a lot clearer about the fact that I was changing my tone or changing my language. And this is something that was me indicating to them that I was getting more and more frustrated. So I had to be quite explicit about that. So these are things that you might be noticing. You might go, oh yeah, no, my child does that. Or I'm always telling them to stop shouting, and they just don't seem able to decrease their volume, or they don't seem able to increase their volume, because everyone always says they whispers, for example. And it can cause difficulties. It can cause a child to come home and say, well, Mrs. So-and-so shouted at me today. And you go and talk to Mrs. So-and-so, and she's absolutely puzzled by why they might think that they're being shouted at, but that can cause them anxiety. And then might be a sort of barrier to them going to school. It can also cause difficulty with their friendships as well. So, and again, it'll often need explicit teaching for some of the children that struggle with understanding nonverbal language. So because of the explicit teaching needed, because it can then impact how they might interpret things that are going on around them, then it can become a special educational need. Some children can really struggle with conversational skills. When we talk about conversation, we talk about reciprocal conversation, so back and forth conversation. And this can be tricky for some people. Sometimes you might find your child kind of just provides a monologue, and they just want to talk at somebody else about something that they find particularly interesting, and they're not really concerned as to whether or not the other person appears to be listening or has any interaction in that conversation, and they certainly don't necessarily want to be interrupted, and don't sort of take kindly to that. You may find that they struggle to turn-take in a conversation and are constantly kind of jumping in with what they have to say. This can often be about difficulty in, they've got an idea and they desperately want to say their idea, and they want to remember what it is because it's really important, but they know that if they don't say it, they're going to forget, so they kind of blurt it out. Or it might be linked to impulsivity, or sometimes also motor planning, so kind of organising their mouths in order to sort of get their speech ready to go out, and kind of getting that the right place in the conversation. They might have difficulty reading the pragmatic language that goes with this, so the indicators that the person is coming to the end of what they're saying and a space for that person to talk might be coming in. But also, when thinking about all of these things, especially if you need to put more thought into them, you then have to do that as well as try and listen to what the other person is saying and think of an appropriate response, which in and of itself can be quite difficult. So actually, you can begin to see how two-way conversation become really tricky, particularly if you're talking to somebody that you don't know very well, or a stranger. If you're going into a shop, and you may find that they find talking to someone in the local cafe or the supermarket, if somebody says, "Oh, hello," that they kind of freeze and withdraw behind you because they find that difficult. So these may be indicators that there's some needs going on there around social differences that perhaps might need special educational provision, and therefore might be a special educational need. A lot of the time, you can find that young people, or all people, might find that they have a difference in understanding jokes or sarcasm, a difference in humour. I rarely get jokes. I don't tend to understand them. I mean, I do find certain comedians funny, but your standard joke that might get said in an everyday conversation, I'm never quite sure if people are joking or not. And that leads me to having to check sometimes. I was talking to a parent once when we were doing a pickup, and he started talking about they'd had some social events over the weekend, and at one point it felt like he was down a big well, and I sort of thought, I think he's joking. I think this is a metaphor, but I'm not entirely sure. So I did actually have to check. I was like, sorry, hang on a minute. Were you actually down a big well? And he's, no, I wasn't. I was like, I didn't think so, but I just needed to check for a moment there. And sometimes that can come across as rudeness. So you might find that your own person is accused of being rude when they're double checking things that they're not entirely sure what the other person means. They may not understand sarcasm, or they may understand sarcasm, but they don't like it, because why not just say what you think? And you can find that often they might have a literal understanding of language. So either sometimes that can be that they don't understand idioms. The classic kind of explanation of this is if somebody says, "Oh, it's raining cats and dogs," and they look out of the window and expect to see cats and dogs falling from the sky. In my experience, that can be the case, but it's often a lot more subtle than that. And that you find that you have to be quite direct in what you're asking them to do. Because actually, when we stop and think about our language, we often don't communicate very clearly. And I can remember being made aware of this once at the dinner table, and my son was kind of waving himself around. He was only quite young, about 4 or 5. And I was saying, "Watch your drink, please. Can you just watch your drink?" And getting increasingly annoyed that he wasn't then stopping waving his arms around and wasn't being any more careful. And later on, I reflected that I wasn't saying anything helpful. What does "watch your drink" mean? I mean, he didn't actually watch the drink, he just completely ignored me. But even if he had, what I didn't say was, "Please stop waving your arms around. I'm worried you're going to knock your water over." And I think if you find your child not doing the things that you ask them to do, or constantly apparently ignoring you, it could be worth just stopping and contemplating, what words have I actually used here? Have I been as clear as I think I have? But again, 1 minute, sorry. Yes, but I can't come and help you with the garage because I'm in the middle of delivering over there. I'm in the middle. You work it out. So again, the reason I'm giving you specific examples is that so you can see what some of these things might look like in your children. And again, Are these a special educational need? Well, they can be, because they can impact how they operate in the classroom. They may well impact how they begin to understand books that they're reading, films that they're watching, possibly interpreting text, for example, or sources for history. So they can be, and they can require special educational provision if it's having an impact on their friendships. They need to have these things explicitly taught to them. Then it may well be that it is a special educational need. But in and of its own, if that is their only difficulty, it's unlikely to be something that they need much support with. But once you start to weave it in with other things, then it can well be. Often we find in this section talk about young people and children that have a difficulty either remembering and or understanding instructions. And what you'll often see this is as you say to your child, can you go upstairs and get your hairbrush and your t-shirt, and you go upstairs 10 minutes later to find them playing in their bedroom or drawing something, and you're like, what are you doing? And your child looks at you with puzzlement. Now, I'm not saying that sometimes your child's not just being a pain in the jacksie, but it may well be that by the time they've got to their bedroom, they've forgotten what it is that they're supposed to do. Yes, but you need to put it in upside down, I think, like that, and then kind of wiggle it around. The other thing is sometimes they may not understand the instructions that you've given them, or they need them breaking down. So there's a constant battle in our house about cleaning out the guinea pigs, for example. I might say, can you please go and clean the guinea pigs out? Actually, that's a very big task. It needs breaking down. What does that actually mean? What does that look like? So actually what I need to say is, can you please shake the poo into a particular place? I did then say that to my daughter. She was very proud that she'd cleaned the guinea pigs out. And what she'd actually done is taken the rugs out of the guinea pig cage and shaken the poo all over the floor and left it there. The cage was clean. The poo was now all over the floor, but she was very happy she'd done a good job. And so I realised my instructions needed to be even clearer than I just sort of made them. Often visuals can work as a support, or one instruction at a time. It can be particularly difficult when instructions are given verbally, and all they kind of hear is the Charlie Brown, wah, 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 and they kind of can't really compute that much verbal information. And actually, that is vital for being able to succeed at school, because I know as a teacher, we give a lot of verbal information. We give it quickly, and we often give it once. And if there's a lot of other things going on, there's other difficulties that child is having, and they're not, totally paying attention, or even if they are paying attention at that time and they don't quite compute, suddenly they're then getting into trouble because the teacher's saying, why haven't you started? What do you mean you don't know what to do? Well, you're not listening. And it may well be that young person needs visual prompts. They may need a one-to-one with them to help them get started.
Do it.
They may need, right. Are you going in that way with the flat bit at the top?
No.
Well, that's why.
Well, it barely fits worse than that.
Well, you just have to move it in and out and give it a wiggle till you find it fitting. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's going to have a big difficulty. If a teacher says, can you go over there and get that, please? And, suddenly again, they might find themselves getting into trouble. And finally, you might find in this area a difficulty with friendships. So you might find that your child is saying, it's difficult. They don't like the playground. It's noisy. It's busy. Mine would often talk about the games travelling too quickly. And actually, if you've ever stood and watched kids in a playground, you can see the speed with which interactions are changing and group dynamics are changing. And sorry, I just got distracted by one of my children on a bike and the other one pulling on his t-shirt as they cycled off. And it's difficult, and it's noisy, and it's visually really busy as well. They might have difficulty understanding other people's intentions. They might have difficulty with rules of the game, with losing and compromising. And you can see how playground difficulties become something that actually they need support with. They need more support than would normally be available, and can suddenly become quite a barrier to education there. someone saying in the question that their child's often being sort of accused of being rude when he doesn't have a filter and just says what he thinks. And I think that's a really common issue. It's something that happens to me. You know, I've been accused of being rude. You know, if somebody asks me a question and I give them my answer,
working.
I'm in the middle of something. So
it just be like a sec.
no, right. I'm really sorry, but I'm going to run out and do this because otherwise they're just going to bother us the whole time. You are really annoying. Can you put Steffi in? Steffi, come on. Steffi, Steffi, what's this? What's this? Don't leave the garage door open, please. Don't leave the garage door open. Sorry, then the dogs escaped. And teachers really don't understand, or the tone of voice is wrong. I do often think as well that we have an incredibly high expectation of children in this world, and children in school, particularly in secondary schools, don't appear to be allowed to be having a bad day or an off day. You know, they're expected to be smiley and happy and polite all of the time, and I think we don't have that same expectation of adults. We're allowed to have bad days and grumpy moods, and it's actually just not. It's not achievable. You know, people do have off days. So cognition and learning is the next area. And this is the one I think most people generally think about when they think about a child or young person having special educational needs. So we've got your standard literacy, for example, which you might come under English as they get into secondary school. And you might notice that there's some difficulties with their reading. So for some children, they might have a slow reading speed. You know, the teacher says, right, read this paragraph. And the other kids, you know, by the time the teacher says, right, now let's do this piece of work, they haven't anywhere near finished yet. And the teacher thinks that they've been dithering and daydreaming. And actually, they're just a very slow reader. They might be behind their peers in their reading, and that might be more noticeable at primary school. Some children really struggle with phonics, either just understanding the concept of it or being able to hear the sound. Certainly one of mine just really struggles with, he just didn't get phonics at all. He couldn't hear them. He couldn't hear the last sounds of words. He couldn't pronounce all of them. It just made no sense to him. And so, you know, it was noticeable when he started reading that the gap between him and his peers was absolutely huge. And in fact, when his younger brother started, so he was in year 2, his younger brother started reception. His younger brother was ahead of him in weeks. And for his younger brother, also he also has his own needs, but he just got it. It was like, oh, that makes sense, I'm going to read. But I think for many children with additional needs, phonics is something that just doesn't resonate with them at all. And they often need to learn to sight read. Unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be that option in schools at the moment. It appears to be this is how we're teaching everybody to read, and here's via phonics, whether or not that works for your child. And that's not overly helpful. Sometimes they can read the words, but they might not necessarily comprehend what's being talked about. So we, you know, perhaps when we were children, we might have done comprehension activities. What does this say? And then let's do some questions to grasp whether or not you've understood the meaning. And that can be quite tricky sometimes. It might be difficult to make inferences or to read between the lines or to understand metaphors. And particularly as they go up into secondary school, things like English, maths, even sort of, not maths, English, history, for example, religious studies, all these kind of subjects rely quite heavily on ability to understand texts in a slightly more sophisticated way. You might need to work out why someone's acted the way they have or what their feelings were. Sometimes you'll just know that your child doesn't like reading, and that is an indicator that there is something potentially behind why they're kind of really against reading. I don't mean just like, oh, I'm not really into books, but kind of really quite strong feelings against something. And you might want to try and work out what you think might be behind that. You might find that your child has difficulties with numeracy or maths. It might be that they really struggle to understand what they've learnt or remember what they've learnt, sorry. I know with my daughter, she actually isn't bad at maths, but she thought she was rubbish. And I actually think for her it was because she struggled to pay attention. But then when she came to the next maths lesson the next day, she got no idea what was going on. And I think for children, they often take on the idea that they're bad at maths, and then that can then become a barrier to learning. But maths is actually quite complicated in terms of its concepts. So they may struggle to understand the concepts behind maths. I have absolutely no visual thinking at all. I only think in narrative. And so mental maths, cannot do it for the life. If you read me out a sum, I can't hold those numbers in my head, so I can't do anything with them. So I was absolutely rubbish at that type of maths. Um, and also then when you get to the maths problems that they put into words, so Harry was on the orange train traveling at 50 miles an hour, and Jack was on the purple train traveling at 25 miles an hour. If you've got difficulties, literacy difficulties, then those difficulties are going to come into the maths sphere as well. So that there might be a crossover there. It might be that you've got difficulties in one of those areas. It might not be across the board, or it might be a particular, it might be a difficulty with phonics specifically. So it can be quite specific. Sometimes our children might have difficulty with writing. We'll think about the physical aspects of writing slightly later on. Here, I mean, they may struggle with spelling, and that might be linked to phonics. They might get their letters the wrong way round or upside down. They might struggle to get started in their writing. They don't know what to start. They don't know how to actually put pen to paper. And there could be all sorts of things behind that. It might be understanding instructions, for example. But sometimes they can really struggle with idea generation as well. And that can be a real barrier to learning, particularly if it's a task where there's quite a lot of scope to what they do. So a creative writing task, for example, you may find that they do nothing because they don't really know what it is they're supposed to do or understand what they're supposed to do. I can remember in history once setting a task which was to write a love letter to Anne Boleyn from Henry VIII. And a lad in my class who at that time had was Asperger's, as they then called it, he was like, I just don't understand what it is you're asking me to do here. I'm not Henry VIII. I don't know how to write a love letter. And he needed a lot of support to understand the task. This was when I was a beginning teacher, a training teacher. I wonder whether I'd still set that same task today. I'm not sure. You might notice that your child, we've talked about this slightly already, but your child is struggling with homework. Now, it may be that you helping them with their homework is showing you the other difficulties that they have. So difficulties with literacy, difficulties with numeracy, for example. So it may be that you're noticing that, but it may be that they're struggling to know what their homework is. So they're not writing it down. Maybe that it's showing that they don't understand the activity, so they're not understanding the instructions. So it can be quite how they're going with homework can be quite useful for you to try and work out what might be going on for them. Sometimes they're just struggling to do it. It might be that they have such clear lines. No, that is schoolwork. I do it in school. This is home. I don't do it. And it might be that you're struggling there. And so thinking about what you might be able to do to support them with that. One of the big difficulties that often arises here is a special educational need, maybe difficulties with things like organisation, planning and prioritising. It takes a lot of skills to put that in place. You might lose things, you might forget things, you might have poor timekeeping, you might be late, you might underestimate how long something will take. A lot of this comes under the title of executive function, how you actually kind of execute the doing of something. And again, if that's impacting on your ability to learn, to be in school, then that can become a special educational need. Attention can often be a big difficulty for young people who've got additional needs, and that can come in a number of different ways. So they might have difficulty in maintaining their attention on something. Their brain hears something interesting over there, and they're 1 minute they're listening to, and the next minute like, oh, what's over there? And so they can get easily distracted, either when they're on a piece of work or when somebody's talking to them or when they're in a class. They might have difficulty kind of getting their attention to focus at the start of a task. This is certainly something that I find very difficult, and I generally need to be up against a deadline and buzzing with adrenaline in order to actually start something. Otherwise, I can't get anything done. You may find that they get bored very easily and they're constantly looking for that new shiny thing that it is they want to do. They may just be very distractible, and that could be by their own thoughts. They could daydream. It might be things they see or hear as they're looking out the window. It might be things going on inside of their body, for example. It may be that they struggle to move their attention from one thing to another. So, they're on this task. So they're often you'll see it with a computer, but they're doing this task, and actually you say, right, it's dinner time. And to move from this task to something else is really tricky. And that might be seen in classes, when they're on one activity and they haven't finished it yet, but the teacher wants them to move on to another activity, and they're like, no, I'm in this activity. My focus is staying here. And actually, the opposite to having difficulty paying attention is it can be hyper focus. And actually, you can have attention difficulties and still have a lot of hyper focus. And this is often a misunderstanding, thinking, well, they can't possibly have ADHD or attention difficulties because look at how they are when they want to do that thing, and they're like, their brains are like zoom. But it can be, even when you can have difficulty paying attention, it's harder to pay attention to things that you're not interested in. It just is, whether you've got attention difficulties or not. But once your brain gets into an activity that gives it a lot of satisfaction and feedback, then you can be completely in the zone to the exclusion of lots of other things. And certainly I know that when I'm pulled away from a task that I'm in the zone on, it's almost painful, and I can get really, really grumpy. Just close, that's fine. I'll look at. Will you remind me to look at their study spikes?
Yeah.
Thank you. I can be really quite grumpy at being pulled away from it, but also because it takes me quite a long time to get back into that state. So if I start an activity that's complicated, get pulled away in the middle of it, and I go back to it, I have to go right back to the thought of my start of my thought process and kind of get my brain up to where I left off and then start again. And that's really challenging. So again, I'm giving you some of these examples in the hope that they might go about, oh, hang on a minute. I do notice about that about my child. I thought they were just being really annoying. You'll often hear parents say, well, they can't possibly, when they want to wander out on that computer game, they're more than capable. But again, it's very rewarding for them to be, it's doing everything it can to keep their attention. That still might mean they have attention difficulties in the classroom, for example. And again, they might need a lot of support to maintain and to regulate their attention. And so therefore it becomes a special educational need. Memory can often have a big impact on cognition and learning. In simplistic ways, there's three types of memory. One of the most important ones for learning in the classroom is your working memory. And that's the short-term memory where you put information that you can then manipulate. So holding 2 or 3 facts in my head so that I can then combine them in order to write a paragraph in my essay, for example, or reading a piece of text, holding the information from it in my head so that I can go and answer the comprehension question, or reading the information on the board, holding it in my head, and then going to write it down in my book afterwards. Now, if you're somebody like me, I'm having to check every 2 seconds. What was it? I've got the first word, I've forgotten the second word. And again, that can become a real barrier to learning for many different reasons. And you might notice that when you're with them at home, you might notice that you sort of say something to them and they've just forgotten it almost instantly. And there can be lots of reasons for that. Short-term and long-term memory are 2 different memory processes. So just because you might have a really good long-term memory, but absolutely appalling short-term memory, or vice versa. But again, you need all those different types of memory in order to solidify and consolidate your learning. So again, memory differences are often a barrier to education, and therefore need more provision. It might need over-learning, for example. It might need new concepts introducing beforehand, but that's over and above that would be normally available in a mainstream school. Your child or young person may just not be in the right state to learn. In occupational therapy terms, they call it calm alert. So you're calm enough to be able to take information in, but you're alert enough, so you're not kind of sleepy, that again, you can take information in. And actually getting your body into that ready to learn state can be really difficult, and they might need support to do that as well. Sometimes our young people can be really stuck in routines or have really rigid thinking. And it can be really difficult to if routine is changed, that can cause a lot of anxiety. And again, can be a barrier to learning. You know, if they turn up and it's not Mrs. Knight today and it's Mrs. Knight's day, but instead she got Mr. Maloney, that might be game over. They might be dysregulated all day. Or you might take a different route to school that morning and they can't cope with that. Or for us, it was crossing the road at a certain point, and not following that routine can cause dysregulation, which means they're not in the right state to learn. Therefore, they're going to need more support. Rigid thinking, likewise, sometimes, I have done it this way, so I'm always going to do it this way. One of my children has very rigid thinking around different ways of doing maths. Once he's learnt one way of, long division, for example, he's absolutely adamant he does not need to know another way. I actually have some sympathy with this, and I don't really understand why, if it works for him, there's an absolute need to teach him another way. But I'm sure someone would explain the logic behind it. But regardless, he's not going to do it. No. He's rigid in that, and you can bribe and punish and do all sorts of things, and he is not moving in his thought process. And you may notice that in other areas as well. And again, if it's one kind of character quirk, it may not amount to anything. But once you start looking at kind of a number of these things, you can begin to see how these needs are going to impact their ability to access an education. Therefore, they're going to need some support with this. They may need a one-to-one that they have a really strong relationship with. So when there are changes in the routine, they can cope with that. Often when children are younger, the end of term, this time of year, and Christmas, December, generally horrific because routines in school go out of the window and they just change the timetables. So everything's all a scatter, and our kids go into major dysregulation, and it's just a nightmare. And you at home are kind of desperately trying to corral them and keep them as vaguely regulated as you can, and it becomes very difficult. And there's only limited you can do because a lot of the dysregulation comes from changes at school. So social, emotional, and mental health, often known as SEM. So if you see SEMH or hear of SEM, then they're referring to this area of needs. And again, like I said before, there is quite a bit of crossover between this and communication and interaction. Don't spend a lot of time worrying about where the social stuff fits. Just put it in one area if you need to, and go with it. But there's a number of different things that come under this, and people often forget, rather not forget this area, but think that this area is not relevant, is not a special educational need, and it absolutely is. There tends to be a big focus on kind of the academics, and you will hear myths saying, if they're not academically behind, then you're not going to get any additional support for your child, and that's absolute nonsense. And actually, for many young people, particularly at the moment, their SEM needs, their social, emotional, mental health needs, are a massive barrier to their ability to access an education. Now, one might argue that the SEN needs have resulted because of other needs not being met, and I think there's quite a lot of truth in that. But nonetheless, they then often become needs in and of themselves. So you may find that your child or young person has differences in how they process emotions or understand emotions. So they might find it harder to regulate their emotions. They'll often find understanding perhaps the difference between anxiety and excitement quite difficult, and excitement can roll over into anxiety quite easily, or they go from 0 to 60 in about 5 seconds, sort of seemingly happy 1 minute and then all out rage the next, and they can't kind of keep themselves on that even keel. You might find they don't understand their own emotions. You're saying, can you please, you look really angry. Okay, I'm really calm. And they don't actually understand what's going on inside their body. They can't interpret it. And they may find that they just can't talk about it, or they can't express it. They can't ask anybody for help. They don't have the language or the understanding or the literacy. And this may be around their emotions and their understanding of their own emotions, but it also may be understanding other people's emotions as well. And sometimes they might find somebody else being very upset really hard to manage, or they might find someone else's anger really difficult. That they might find a teacher tells another child off, and actually your child then comes home terrified about going back to school because somebody else got told off, and maybe next time it'll be them. And again, it needs more support than would normally be available in the school often, and therefore can become a special educational need, or they're not in the right state to learn, or they get dysregulated at school. Mood can sometimes be a special educational need, so particularly if they have a lot of anxiety, whether that be a diagnosable anxiety condition or anxiety caused due to other differences, sensory needs, for example, or unmet needs in general. You may get to a point where a low mood becomes a special educational need because it's impacting their ability to be in school or to learn. Self-esteem can have a big impact on learning. If they are a perfectionist, or they think that they're not good enough, and therefore it becomes easier not to engage rather than to fail, or it becomes too fearful, they might need a lot of support with their self-esteem in order to help them engage in learning. Or it might be that they need support in regulating their moods. Again, that kind of, they call it lability of moods, so that kind of 0 to 60, or good mood to bad mood, and back again very quickly. Often, I think with mood is an indicator that other needs need meeting, and this is a need, particularly when it gets bad. But actually, it's okay. This is an example of a need, but where else do we need to meet their needs to kind of help with this particular area? Behaviour can come under this. And here I'm thinking of often your sort of fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. And either your child may have one particular response that they go to. It may be a different response in different environments, or they might flip between them. So fight, it might be that they get very angry very quickly. You may find that when they leave school, that you see that, or it might be happening in school. They might be at the stage where they're throwing chairs across the classroom when they become dysregulated. It's normally a fear response. Something has happened which has caused them to be fearful, and it responds as anger. They might be a runner. It might be that they go and hide, or they manage to, escape out of school when they're triggered. They could be a freeze person. It could be that they just go, they could either literally freeze, perhaps even go into shut down and appear to fall asleep, or it could be that it's kind of an internal freeze, and they're sort of don't really say very much, don't really do very much, or perhaps sometimes they just put their head down on the desk and do nothing. And then lastly, we have fawn, which is kind of try and please people around them. It might be seen as masking sometimes as well, kind of covering up the difficulties that they're having. Masking can be a bit wider than that. You might have a child who masks and looks perfectly well behaved at school, but the minute they get out of school, this very different child appears in front of you, and what you hear is that they're fine at school, and the implication that, well, then it must be a home issue. That is very, very common. But that is not a reason not to meet those child's needs, because just because they're not showing them doesn't mean that they haven't got them. We need to look at why, what's going on, what are some of the needs we've talked about already that might be hidden here. Your child or young person might have difficulties understanding social concepts, so they may not understand social hierarchies. They may treat everybody exactly the same, be it a 4-year-old child or the head teacher. And again, I might have sympathies with that, but in our modern world, that may not be seen as acceptable, and it may be getting them into trouble. They may not understand social rules that we have, so etiquette of please and thank you, of hello and goodbye. Might be something tricky, and that may be fine at your house and it is in mine, certainly, but suddenly it might be the school teacher says, well, where's my thank you? And that may send them into fight flight, for example, and then suddenly they're in trouble and it becomes an issue. They may have friendship difficulties, so they might have difficulty maintaining friendships. They might often be falling out with friends, or they might be very lonely and they might have difficulty making friends, for example. That might be something that they need support with. And it may be that your child is experiencing bullying and are socially very vulnerable, and that's something that's going to require a high level of support and therefore becomes a special educational need. There we go. I've got 2 slides for sensory and physical, so we'll look at the kind of more physical side of things first of all. I haven't covered in here some of the more obvious physical needs. So, for example, if your child needs a wheelchair or a standing frame or something along those lines, then I think that that's a more obvious need that may well need to be met. So I've gone for the slightly less obvious ones, perhaps. You may find that your child finds writing really difficult or appears not to like writing or finds it painful. They may have difficulty with the size of their letters, the orientation of their letters, how much force they put on the page, either too much or not enough. Alongside that, you may find that they find using cutlery difficult, or that they struggle with getting dressed, so buttons and zips and shoelaces. In other words, it's their fine motor skills, the kind of more intricate details they need to use their hands for, that they find difficult. I struggle with drawing, using a ruler, for example. And that's often going to need more support. You may find that they're always moving or fidgeting or rocking or getting out of their seat, and you're always being told they need to sit still. I mean, I remember watching one of my children, got a video of him. He was at the dinner table. He had a knee on the chair. He had a foot on a wheelie sit on toy. He was going back and forth with his foot on the toy. So he was kind of half up, half down, and he was eating soup at the same time because that's how he was regulated to eat. He also spent a lot of time sat on one of the peanut balls, but on the high end of it, sort of rocking off and forth. He'd regularly sort of smack his head. You might find they get into trouble. I was always in trouble for rocking on the back of my chair, for example. And last parents' evening for my eldest, I was told, "Can you talk to him about rocking on his chair?" And I'm like, "Well, have you worked out what sensory needs aren't being met and how you can support him with that? Because actually he's getting something out of it." And getting out the seat as well is a classic one, and they're often getting into trouble there. But again, it's about thinking, so what needs aren't being met and how do we meet them so that they don't need to do that as much? Or considering, is it a problem? Why is it a problem? What can we do to support them? You may find that your child has difficulties with self-care, maybe toileting. They need support with that in school. There might be difficulties with washing their hair, brushing their teeth. And while some of those may not be things that happen in school, actually some of the needs that go with it, the sensory stuff that we'll think about in a minute, the fine motor skills, may well be things that they need support with via occupational therapy, for example, in school. You may notice that your child is incredibly clumsy. They're either walking into door frames or breaking things or tripping over things or people. And that may be, we'll talk about it in a minute, but kind of it's a proprioception thing. It's often not knowing where their body is in space or having poor fine motor or gross motor skills. You may find that they find running difficult, or they run in a slightly awkward way, or they struggle to jump or jump with 2 feet, or that they're always running rather than walking. And sometimes I think the velocity and the speed actually helps them stay upright. You may find that they struggle to catch and throw a ball. All these can be indicators of fine or gross motor difficulty, hand-eye coordination, cross-body coordination, for example. And again, it may well need looking at from an occupational therapist, because these things do actually then go on and have an impact on their ability to be in the learning environment. So accessing PE, the writing skills, having the strength to sit in a chair, for example. Because you'll often find that you'll notice poor posture. So you might find you'll see that I'm often supporting my head with my hand. So I don't have very good shoulder strength or core strength. So my head feels very heavy. So I need to kind of keep it upright. You might find that they're very slouched. Or that they're often kind of, got, if you could see me right now, I've got one leg up, one leg crossed, and I'm constantly fidgeting and moving around. And that's very common. And it's often linked to hypermobility. Many of our young people will be hypermobile in some way or another. And actually, again, that can have a huge impact on their ability to access the classroom and the learning, either because of writing can be very, very painful, sitting can be very tiring and distracting, standing for long periods of time. You can be in quite a lot of pain, for example. So there's lots of things that might make learning even harder. You might notice that your child tiptoe walks. That might be something they need more support with. Might be indicative of some issues with their Achilles and various other things. You might find that the coordination is not very good. Maybe they find cutting things out very difficult, threading beads onto a string, doing any kind of activities that require that sort of hand-eye coordination and so forth. I saw I had a question here, which was, should they be told off for things like rocking and getting out of their chair? No, no, absolutely not. I mean, you've got to look at these things in context. If teachers don't know they've got additional needs, then I can see how it does happen. I really think that nowadays teachers ought to be more aware of these things. Young children are not designed to sit still for very long, and so I think it's perfectly understandable that they're up and moving. But if you're beginning to understand that this child has some additional needs, I mean, we'll look at an image in a minute. Think about this, but from my perspective, any unwanted behaviour, and the air quotes are important there. First of all, the question is, why is it unwanted? What's the problem with it? Generally, it's just that you as the adult don't like it, find it annoying. But then there may be good reasons, so let's find out what it is. And then what need is being, can we see here? Why is that child unable to sit still? Why are they rocking? Why are they fidgeting? They're attempting to find some kind of regulation or some kind of comfortable position. And so what are we going to do in order to support them with that? How are we going to help them? They are the child and we are the adult. And it's our job to work out what's going on and put the support in place. So no, absolutely shouldn't be getting in trouble for it. Which leads us on to sensory. Now, sensory is a massive, massive area. We could talk all night about sensory needs. But again, this has a huge impact on our children and young people's ability to access the school and classroom and learning environment. And there's lots of different senses, more than our 5 senses, but we'll stick with the standard 8. Oh, I've missed one off here, actually. So for a lot of our kids, they may just find school overwhelmingly busy. They may say they don't like school, but they can't really understand it. And it's worth thinking about then, when you're in other environments, what do you notice? So we used to take our children up to London to the museums, and didn't realise it at the time, but they were exhausting experiences. We got 3 kids, and there was just me and my husband, and we would spend our whole time in like this tag team. Right, you've got 1 and 2, I've got number 3. Number 2 incoming, I'm taking number 3. Their attention went out the window. They'd spend a maximum of 20 seconds at each, post. They'd be hyperactive. They'd be all over the shop. They couldn't hear you, and the first time we went to a SEN session, and it was just a completely different experience because it was so much less busy. It made me realise how heightened and dysregulated they became from busyness. So think about what your child's like in supermarkets, cities, busy environments. And if they struggle, that may give you an indication as to something that they're struggling with school, for example. You may find that they struggle to see things in busy places. So, for example, they struggle to find food in the fridge or an item of clothing in a drawer. And for a long time, I just thought this was, my husband being really irritating because he's the worst for this. And then I discovered it was a thing. And actually, your brain has difficulty distinguishing certain objects in busy environments. And that can become really difficult. And you might want to see how good they are at some simple where's Wally's, for example. You can get some simpler ones and kind of see how easy do they find searching for particular bits of information in a very busy environment. And that may begin to give you some ideas as to why perhaps they struggle with reading, particularly once they get onto books with more words on the page. They may have difficulty recognising faces. They may not distinguish people's faces very well. And again, that will have difficulties with teachers and peer groups and so forth. So they might need some support there. It's not uncommon to find sudden loud noises scary, often hand dryers and fire alarms. Might be loud noises in general, but more often than not, it's ones that take them by surprise they're not prepared for. I've had parents say to me, but they're absolutely fine with loud noises. They like going to, fun fairs and theme parks. And then you'd say, how are they when you go to the toilet when you're out in public? Oh, well, they can't cope with a hand dryer. And you think, okay, so they're not actually all right with noise. Well, they're all right with noise in certain contexts. And actually, again, if you think classrooms are noisy places and there's all these different voices and so forth, and distinguishing out the noises you need versus the noises that you don't can be really tricky. You might find that your child is what other people call a fussy eater. So they are restricted in what they eat, or they only like certain behaviours. They only like beige food or processed food that they can be relied upon for it to be the same each time. They might not like certain foods touching. They might require foods to be in certain plates and cups, for example. I have to have certain types of cups to drink tea. If it's a very, very thin mug, I'm not going to like the tea, so I would go without or go and pour it into a thicker mug. It sounds very, awkward, but it's absolutely pivotal to my enjoyment of that cup of tea, for example. And again, why could this be a SEND? Well, for lots of reasons. One, they might need some support to help them have a wider diet, to be healthier, to tolerate the difference. They might need just support in exploring different textures, but they might actually not be able to eat at school because of their food differences. And therefore, if they're hungry, that's going to have an impact on their regulation in the afternoon. It's at the bottom here, but I'll talk about it here. But smell can often also be an issue. Some smells can actually be physically painful, or make people feel sick. And smells that other people think are just innocuous. Juicy fruit chewing gum is a particular hatred of mine. I mean, it makes me feel physically ill. And I can be sat at the back of a bus, and if somebody gets on the bus chewing juicy fruit chewing gum, I can smell it from the back. When I was teaching, my desk was right away from the door, and the minute they walked through the door, I'd be like, I can smell it, get it out. I can't have that smell in here. Other smells are actually they hurt my nose. Now, if I'm in pain from a smell, or the smell is making me feel physically ill, I'm not going to be concentrating on anything else. I'm going to be thinking about the distress inside my body. Some people can either feel pain very extremely or not at all. So I've got a mix of these. One who the most smallest, seemingly small event can cause this huge shock and response to the body, a perceived amount of pain. Whereas I've got another one who can stub his toe and have no idea that anything's happened until he sees the blood. And at that point, he acts like he should be in pain. He knows what pain should look like, but he doesn't seem to actually feel it. And again, that needs some support, because that can actually be dangerous, or he's ill and no one realizes because he doesn't notice. You might find that they like a lot of very deep touch, or alternatively like very sensitive touch, or they can be very over responsive to sensitive touch, and actually that can cause them to go into dysregulation and meltdown, which in a busy corridor might be really tricky. You might find that they really struggle with certain clothes, and school uniform can be a massive barrier for some children, or to labels and tags and so forth. You might find that they either love or hate swinging, bouncing, spinning, and you'll often find that they're craving that kind of input, and that can sometimes come across as quite rough play as well and get them into trouble. But actually, they're in need of a certain type of physical input into their body that OT can help you with, in order to help regulate them. And I sometimes think that some kids, when they're kind of very physical towards other people, kind of shoving and pushing or hitting out, can also, again, be about getting that feedback and helping them regulate. And finally, we've got this sense called proprioception, which is understanding where is my body in space. And you might notice with your children that they're always leaning on somebody or leaning on something, or they're kind of walking around leaning on walls, or they're banging into things or tripping over things. And they don't really know where their body is in space. They walk past someone and accidentally hit them in the face, not because they had any intention of doing so, and they're not just being, careless. They just genuinely don't realise where their hand ends and where their hand is in relation to the other person's face. And so these things can happen really easily. So lots of ideas then about what special educational needs might look like in your child, and what sorts of ways of explaining it. If you know that your child has got difficulty with smell or taste or touch, you might want to start talking about sensory issues, for example. But what can you actually do with this information? I think one of the most important things that you can do is to start writing it down, keeping a diary, making notes, just jotting some thoughts down to you. And if you're at the point where you think you're either going to need to apply for an EHCP or to go for a diagnosis, you might want to start thinking about some of these things historically as well. What about when they were a baby? What about when they were a toddler? What can you remember about little quirky things linked to a lot of this at those points? In terms of school, you probably want to start talking to the teacher and maybe the SENCO, raising some of your concerns with them. You might want to do that verbally, or you might want to put it in writing. If you do it verbally, I would absolutely follow it up with an email so that you start to lay your paper trail. It could be worth observing your child or young person in other settings. So what are they like in swimming lessons? It's a really good place to notice attention difficulties in swimming lessons, and sensory differences, because there's a lot of echo, there's a lot of noise, and you'll often see that the kid that's struggling or that's got differences because they're the one bobbing around in the completely wrong, different direction to everybody else in their own world, or kind of doing little dances or swimming under the water and not watching what's going on. You can ask for feedback from the swimming teacher, from the scout leader, from the art club they go to. So, have you noticed anything? Could you pop something in writing for me so I can share it with school? If things are really struggling, you might want to ask for an observation. Perhaps the SENCO can go and do an observation in the classroom. Maybe they can get somebody from an outreach service to come and do an observation, particularly if your child's really starting to struggle. And the Holy Grail, you could see if an EP could come and do an observation, an educational psychologist. It's probably unlikely given where we're at with services at the moment, but it's a possibility maybe. Many schools will have somebody like a high-level teaching assistant or a teacher that knows how to do some basic assessments of literacy abilities. So kind of a screen for where, what their reading age is, what their processing speed is, and so forth. And that can be really useful. You might be at the point where you actually think you need a referral for an assessment, either from from CAMS or from paediatricians, perhaps from SALT or OT. It varies area to area as to the processes, but you might think that actually it's time for a diagnosis of some stuff. And I think that diagnoses, whilst support and help should not be conditional on that child having a diagnosis, actually it can be really helpful for moving the narrative on from a child who's naughty or at pain or just needs to do better into a child that needs support. It shouldn't be that way, but unfortunately it can be helpful. I think the last thing to think about is this slide here. It's called the behaviour iceberg, and it's thinking a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today is actually behaviour. It's the things that we can see. And I think it can become really useful to start thinking about what's underneath the stuff that we can see. What is it we don't, we're not seeing that is impacting that behaviour? So, a child that's running around a playground screeching and hitting people, why? No child wakes up and goes, oh, I know what I want to do. I'm going to go and make very loud screeching noises and hit people. What's going on there? Is the screeching about blocking out unwanted sensory input? Is it that's their way of expressing excitement or joy? Is it that they're using it to kind of get a physical feeling inside that they find calming? Are they getting feedback from the hitting? Do they not know what to do with themselves? One of the things I realised I forgot in sensory is one of the things, the other senses is something called interoception. In other words, understanding what's going on inside your body. So knowing you need the toilet, knowing that you're hungry, knowing that you're thirsty. Children may not be getting those signals, or adults, and therefore being hungry can impact your ability to concentrate, to learn. But if you don't know you're hungry, then you don't know how to put that right. I think the first thing to always think about when you're thinking about what lies beneath this behaviour, first and foremost, is what sensory needs underlie this behaviour. Once that kind of get you thinking through. So that's the end of the formal part of the presentation. So